Okay, so we're going to begin now. Hello and good evening, everyone. On behalf of the team at the Center for Integrative Anti-Racism Studies, I would like to welcome you to the inaugural launch of our Sears and Conversation web series. Tonight's conversation will be on dismantling anti-Black racism in schooling and education. Before we start, I would like to begin with acknowledging the land we are on. The sacred land on which we stand has been a site of human activity for 15,000 years. This land is the territory of the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River. The territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Toronto is home to a large Indigenous population, including residential school survivors and intergenerational family members who have been impacted by the history and legacy of the residential school system. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land.
Thank you so much, Julie. My name is Janelle, and I will be co-moderating. I'll invite the other panelists to put their video on now. And thank you for that. So when we think about land, we're also thinking about the critical intersections of anti-Black racism and anti-Indigenous racism. Today, we're having a conversation particularly about anti-Black racism, but we're looking at the connections and tensions when it comes to anti-Black racism and anti-Indigenous racism and how this impacts Black and Indigenous students in the education and schooling system. We speak from our lived realities and lived experiences as Black educators, researchers, activists, parents, family, community members, and friends, but we think about our intertwined histories and our connection to the land as well, our connection and loss of land as well, and what that means for us in terms of our responsibilities as Black people in Turtle Island, as Black educators as well. We're thinking of the project of colonialism, capitalism, white supremacy, patriarchy, which was based on dispossession of land, exploitation of labor, genocide, and slavery. We cannot forget these histories and how they're intertwined. So we ask these questions in terms of our own positionality as well. For myself, having family that was dispossessed from Africa and brought to the Caribbean, and now myself being a Black woman in Turtle Island, these are questions that I must ask, and these are actions that I must take as well. So when it comes to land back and movements like that, how do we as Black educators, activists, and researchers raise our voice in solidarity and take a stance in terms of Wet'suwet'en Strong and other issues? How do we see these issues as linked and connected, particularly to the movement for Black liberation and Black Lives Matter right now? So though the struggle is unique, the struggle for Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination and Black liberation, we do see these struggles as connected, and we speak to it through an embodied experience and embodied knowledges. So when thinking about dismantling anti-Black racism and the current health pandemic that we are in, we're also thinking through how we can link struggles of Indigenous sovereignty to struggles of Black liberation so that our students can be treated with love, with care, and with their full humanity at the end of the day. So thank you for joining.
Once again, thank you for joining us. My name is Julie Lucy, and I'm a graduate coordinator at Sears and an MA student in the Social Justice Education Department at OISE. I'll be co-moderating tonight with Janelle. So for tonight's conversation, we will reflect on the effects COVID-19 has had in exacerbating longstanding systemic injustices as highlighted by Black and racialized communities being further exposed and disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. And in what ways the return to school limits the choices neighborhoods with racialized frontline workers may have regarding their children's educational options.
We're also looking at the resurgence of global uprisings which occurred over the summer to defund, to abolish the police, to imagine something new. We're also looking at Canada's complicity and involvement with the white supremacist anti-Black state that we're in. As we know, the consequences of the system would only result in endless funneling of Black students through the school to prison pipeline. And this disproportionately affects students' outcomes for Black, for Indigenous, and for racialized students. So tonight, our collective community amongst educational activists, scholars, and community leaders aims to propose what dismantling of anti-Black racism can look like for education system. We know that the conversation has come up time and time again, and there are many of you who've been doing this fight for decades, but we are also quite hopeful, and we're confident that our panelists will help us to imagine new futures and relay such ideas into action.
So without further delay, we are pleased to introduce our esteemed panelists, beginning with Ms. Anna K. Brown. Anna K. Brown has lived in the Jane and Finch community for over 12 years with her husband and 3 children. She received her bachelor's degree in criminal justice from Humber College in 2016. She has a co-chair for the Jane Finch Education Action Group for the past 2 years. She is also a part-time employee for Jane Finch Family Center, working on the Black Creek Fair Economies project. In the last 9 years, she has been an active lead in her community, working with various grassroots and community organizations for the advancement of the Jane and Finch community.
Next, we have Fiona Lloyd Henry. Fiona is an educator who migrated from Jamaica and has worked with the Peel District School Board for more than 10 years. While serving as coordinator for equity and inclusive education, her core responsibility included coordinating the Peel District School Board's We Rise Together action plan. Fiona's undergraduate work in education is from UE, the University of West Indies, and her graduate work is from OISE, the University of Toronto. Fiona is a praxis scholar and activist educator, and Fiona also serves on a number of boards and not-for-profit organizations which advocate for Black children. In 2019, Fiona was awarded with the United Way's Community Leadership Award for her work as a Black community advocate. Fiona is a vice principal and executive member of PACE, the Peel Association of African Canadian Educators. Welcome, Fiona.
And lastly, we have Nigel Barif. Nigel Barif is an executive officer with the Elementary Teachers of Toronto, president of the Urban Alliance on Race Relations, board member of the Canadian Anti-Hate Network, and organizer with Ontario Education Workers United. His efforts have been recognized through a number of community service awards, including the 2011 Heroes Award and the 2012 J.S. Woodsworth Award. He holds a master's degree from the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education. Thank you for all being here.
Thank you so much, Julie, for that. And we're so grateful for everyone who is here now. So next we will turn it over to Professor George Day, our director at the Center for Integrative Anti-Racism Studies. So we'll start off with Professor Day to provide some remarks.
Thank you, Janelle, and welcome everyone. Actually, I'm so glad, Janelle, you used the word collective community. I mean, this is something that we are doing together as a community. We all have a responsibility in terms of not just the conversations, but how we work together to bring the change that we want to see. And on behalf of the Center for Integrative Anti-Racism Studies at OISE, I want to thank everyone who is listening in, and hopefully this is a conversation that will give us a food for thought to see how we mobilize and work together to bring the change. As was said, many of us have been doing this work for quite a bit some time now, and sometimes we get frustrated, and every day we seem to get frustrated. We just only saw today the weak charges that have been brought in the case of Breonna Taylor, right? Which is so depressing, and it makes you really get upset, get angry. But let's move that rage into action and bring about a change. I'm also very grateful that we have partnered with Body Day Learning Institute in Halifax in having this initiative. And hopefully this will lead to more of such conversations and action from the group. So thank you, and let's listen in and share the food for thought that our excellent panelists are going to give us some ideas. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nana, for that. Next, we have Dr. George Frimpong, the Director of the Research for the Dalmore Buddy Day Learning Institute, to make some welcome remarks.
Thank you, Janelle. We are also very glad to partner with Nana and the Center CIARS on this initiative. And I'd like to thank our CEO, Sylvia, and the DBDLI board for their support in building this relationship with the center. DBDLI is a very young organization established in 2012, just about 8 years ago, but has achieved a lot. We have our own proud Afrocentric space on 5450 Cornwallis Street, and you're all welcome to visit us when you come into Halifax. We have a published unit helping us develop resources to address anti-Black racism in schools, and the resources are available at our website at dbdli.ca. And we also have a dynamic youth initiative working with our elders to address racial injustices in our schools. On the research front, we have over a dozen research initiatives through collaborations with several universities, including U of T, through Professor Day. We are currently developing our international journal. We have a vision to lead, to be a lead in non-government organizations on Afrocentric educational research and practices. And we believe that our relationship with your center would help us to achieve this vision. Once again, on behalf of our CEO and the board of directors of DBDLI, I would like to welcome you all to this unique occasion. I know we are all looking forward to a very productive discussion on anti-Black racism, the fight we've been fighting for so many years and now need to intensify. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Day, and also Dr. Frimpong.
For everyone watching, please join our conversation on social media using the hashtag Sears in Convo. You can access this webinar on YouTube and Facebook Live, and you can also follow us on Twitter at OisySears. And all information will be available in the chat if you're watching from Zoom. So the format of this session is as follows. We'll have 30 minutes of opening remarks with 10 minutes allocated to each panelist, and then we'll have 45 minutes of a live Q&A with the audience. We have vetted questions from those who have submitted questions through registration, so those who have consented to appear on camera will ask their question to our respective panelists. We will also take questions from off-camera registrants and those who submit questions via social media and the Q&A chat box. Lastly, we will end with our closing remarks. Our volunteers and coordinators who have worked very hard to make this happen will come on screen and we'll share community updates. So without further ado, we'll start. We'll begin with Fiona, followed by Anna Kay, and then Nigel. So I'm passing it over to you, Fiona. Thank you.
Thank you. I was thinking this afternoon as I was getting ready for today's talk that I don't feel like I have very many answers. And so I thought I'd title my remarks with, "Today I have few answers for you." I'm honored to be here, and I will endeavor to heed the entreaties of Dr. Ibrahim Kendi. And instead of engaging in blanket denial of the ways in which anti-Black racism operates in public education, I will opt instead for some confession. confession in the ways in which racism, and in particular, anti-Black racism shows up in our schooling system. We know it's endemic in everything in education, in the curriculum that we have, in erasure and the mutation of Black lives, in the negative and essentializing representation of Black people, in how Black children and Black people in general are positioned, how we're never seen as the subjects or scholars or the authors of our own lives, but instead as objects and recipients of study. The ways in which we're seen as not being knowledge builders or knowledge holders, but as blank slates to be filled with notions of white supremacy. We see anti-Black racism in the disparities in discipline, in suspensions and expulsions, in hyper-surveillance, in the ways in which we position Blackness as deviance and Black children as representatives, as representative of danger and criminality. In our schools, we see this where Black children are afforded little autonomy over their lives, over their body, out of what they study, of what they do. Robin Maynard in Policing Black Lives says, Black children are seen as larger than their actual size, as being impervious to hurt and harm. They're not seen as vulnerable or are the object of empathy. She describes schools as carceral places that are punitive and hostile, where Black children are greeted with a presumption of guilt. And all of the practices that we have contribute to the process of racialization, where young children, young non-Black children are taught to despise Blackness. We see this in other ways as well. We see it for example, in the ways in which we practice colorblindness in education. Ostensibly, we have, race neutral or race, colorblind practices that are not taking in race or anything into consideration. But we know this not to be true. So we pretend we're adopting these policies, but we do the opposite. We see it in the ways in which our policies and our practices and our programs normalize white supremacy and racial domination. Educators, including many educational leaders, consistently abdicate their responsibility to engage with issues of racial justice and instead move to innocence. They adopt this sort of colorblind attitude and deny the racism that's inherent in education. In fact, not only do they deny it, but for those of us who address issues of racial domination are seen as troublemakers and seen as problematic, right? We see it, for example, in the recent review of our own board in Peel. We see the ways in which these racism, ends up in all sorts of disparate outcomes for Black children, in regional choice programs, in streaming, in the way we hire or promote Black educators, in disparate discipline, in the ways we assess and evaluate students, in the way we designate people special ed. Everything, Black children are overrepresented, except in the area of giftedness, which in of itself is problematic, but Black children are not positioned as people who are quote unquote gifted. We see it with police in schools, right? And we think about some of these and we pretend that these are all sort of accidental things, as if all of these things are not the production of race, as if all of these don't contribute to racial capitalism. All of these are actual modes of racial segregation in our schools. By ensuring that our children are streamed into particular programs and into particular classes, we are basically extracting Black children from our, the daily business of schools and confining them to particular spaces. In reflecting on what I talk about today, I was reflecting on how the slave patrols and Black codes play out in schools, right? Where large groups, which means anything over 2, God forbid, of Black children are seen as problematic and are discouraged from meeting or talking with each other. We see it in the ways in which, even when people don't explicitly tell you that you're not supposed to gather in groups, we police ourselves because we've been socialized into this panopticon where we start to see we police ourselves. It's like, okay, they're going to think we're here talking to each other. What will they think we're talking about? And so even Black children learn not to do this. We see it in the ways in which Black students could, be searched or stopped and asked questions about, what they're doing, what they're up to, almost as if this sort of impromptu thing keeps them totally, off balance, because you never know where it's going to come from. So these extrajudicial operations of policing in schools, you're never quite sure who's going to operate it next and when it's going to happen and what's the result going to be. We see it in the way we forcefully and consistently and unrelentlessly discourage any sort of critical engagement, any questioning or challenging of systems by Black students or by Black staff or by Black parents. God forbid you challenge your oppression. Instead, we practice the inculcating of shame and nurturing the silences of Black students, where Black students, feel like they have to almost fold themselves into smaller and smaller sizes to withstand the attacks and to create even a smaller body, where it could be where it could be a target of any sort of annihilation or damage. And we see all this while we deny, anything that's meaningful. We have by Black people, right? I was thinking, what a shame it is that Black children who are socialized into white supremacy could grow up without having any sense of their history, any sense of their culture. What is it like when you grow up and you've never, as a Black person, you've never heard the name Garvey, when you've never heard the name Kwame Nkrumah, when you've never heard of George Day, when you've never heard of Janelle, right? You've never heard about anybody who's doing anything at all by Black people. You never, you never get a chance to engage with pride. Instead, you have to sit in shame while people laud the experiences of enslavers and monarchs who've contributed to your enslavement, right? Like, these are the people you're supposed to hold up in high esteem. And so as we think about this and the denial, when we pretend on a whole wide scale that we're not, that racism is not operating in every way, we squander every opportunity that we have, or responsibility to confront and dismantle not only those oppressive practices, but the prejudices that create these inequities in the first place and lead, frankly, to the racial trauma experienced by Black people in public schools. We know that our schooling system began as a way forward in the colonial project. We know that it started so that we could inculcate, or so that our oppressors could inculcate ideologies of white middle class, monolingual, cis hetero, patriarchal, able-bodied superiority. We know that, right? And so as we step into this semester and we get busy addressing issues of COVID, and we focus on hand sanitizing, I just hope we find time in all of this to remember that education can be liberatory, and that education can, help to provide a way forward. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Fiona. It's always amazing and refreshing to hear you put all your thoughts together and just really take us through the historical to where we are now. And I really enjoyed that you mentioned the Black codes as well, right? In terms of the policing of Black bodies and Black people and how that plays out in the everyday experience of Black students in the halls, you know, outside, all these no loitering signs, where Black students and also us who are adults, we can't enjoy just Black joy, right? And Black life. So, you know, thank you, thank you, thank you for those wonderful, remarkable comments. And I share your sentiment wholeheartedly. So next we will be going to a wonderful and amazing community voice. We're going to be turning to Anna K. Brown. Turning it over to you.
Thank you, and I'm just grateful to be on this platform, just to share some of my experience and also my community experience. So once again, my name is Anna Kay, and I live in the Jane and Finch community for the last 12 years with my family, including my 3 children, and I'm also the co-chair for the Jane and Finch Education Action Group. And I want to say what probably got me involved in education and around advocacy work is, as a parent, I had a 4-year-old child at that time who was having a difficulty in school. And as a parent who was also in school, working on my degree in criminal justice, I had to think about how was I going to able to address some of these issues that he was facing. And I had a great teacher, fortunately, who was able to help me navigate that system. But it was one particular incident within the school system that really got me into this advocacy work. And that was one day my son teacher invited me into his classroom just to have just to see how my son was doing and how his interaction with the other students were. And the principal walked in and she saw me and she was taken back. And she went on to scolding that teacher in front of me. And I thought, oh my gosh, I've just gotten this teacher in trouble. And she just wanted for me to just be able to observe my child and just see what we can work on. And I remember I went home and I just thought about it. And for like 2 weeks, it was just at the forefront of my thinking. And I just remember I called the school and I said to the lady at the front, I said, I just need to speak with the principal. And I just remember I went back to the school and I said, I just want to tell you that when you reprimanded that teacher in front of me, that taught me something. And it had the impact that it had on me that I'm still thinking about it 2 weeks later. And for some parents, that would have been like a no, they would have never gone back to school, but that ignites something in me to get involved in parent council, to be a part of how I can do some decision making and also help those parents who are having that hard time navigating that school system. So some of the work that we've just been doing in the Jane and Finch community is, anti-Black racism our community has been facing that for decades. That's nothing new. But I think what COVID-19 or the pandemic have done is lay the foundation that we now as a community or just as Canadians can no longer ignore the impacts and systematic barriers that are in place for Black and racialized community. Even when we're thinking about everything that's happening in the States and even here too, with the death of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and we're thinking about even the gun violence that many of our communities are facing, and how does that all correlates with our school systems. When we think about the policing, they got $25 million and the community got $6 million to address gun violence. That's a very big discrepancy right there. When we talk about our schools, our infrastructure, our teachers, when we're talking about SROs in our schools, which we fought very hard to get those out of the public, but I know they're still in the Catholic. You know, the death of Jordan Manor, and how our response as a school, or even just as a school system, was the first thing was to put more police in the schools when there were already over policing in the communities, like Jane and Finch. So when we go back to the school system and we're talking about systematic neglects of our students, what we're watching that's happening in Peel District, where parents are now tired and they're shouting loud and are at the forefront of trying to make sure that their children can be represented in the school system, that their children can benefit from this education system. And also, how can we collectively, as racialized people, have our influence to help our children navigate and be successful in a system that was never designed for them. So those are some of the issues that my community is always fighting. I mean, it's not just limited to the school system, in the criminal justice system, in the healthcare system. It's always a constant struggle for racialized people to find their voices in those spaces. And, you know, as I said, this pandemic has just forced us to slow down and see the bigger pictures. And it's sad that it had to take the death of maybe maybe 1,000 Black man. George Floyd is not the one or the first or the fifth or the sixth for us to be really having this conversation in a large context, even with the federal government, about addressing anti-Black racism. So I'm just gonna leave my thought right there. And as I said, I'm just thankful for just being a part of this.
Thank you very much, Anna Kay, for your insightful remarks, especially on sharing your experiences within the school system of witnessing a teacher being reprimanded. And that's an example of how the violence of anti-Black violence in society is reproduced in our school system, and how that inspired you to get more involved in your child's school is an example of how Black advocacy amongst Black parents is extremely important within the school system. So thank you. We'll now turn it over to Nigel Barif. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Janelle. Thank you to the center for allowing me to participate in this community gathering. And I just so agree with that. And, you know, Anna Kay's being so humble, man, that Jane and Finch Action Against Poverty group, like, took on the board to say, get police out of our schools. And now it was a coalition, no doubt, but the parents were so strong, and the Black parents of our children were so strong that the board had to listen to them. And it's the example of the kind of fight back that is necessary as we move forward. And Fiona, man, thank you for just grounding us into exactly what is happening in our system right now, and the erasure of our children within the school right now, and how these systems continue to perpetuate itself, even more with COVID happening. You know, when you said that colorblind attitude, I'm like, because I'm a school teacher in the system, right? Like, I get it. Like, yes, I see it. And it's like, even when you see it, how hard it is to fight it, and how implicated you sometimes even feel because you're in it. So thank you so much. And that streaming, and you really got me when you said, you know, we're overrepresented in everything except for gifted. It's like, exactly. Anyway, so I can't add more on to what the two have already said. So I'm going to kind of adjust my remarks, because I'd rather just kind of feel, you know, build on to what's already been said previously. Yeah, so COVID is now exposed exactly what's happening in our communities. You know, there's too many academics on here that already have the data better than I do, that know that COVID is disproportionately affecting our children. Yes, the board took money out of, I'm talking specifically the Toronto District School Board, but lots of boards were forced to take money out of their reserve funds that's supposed to be kept there for liability issues, to specifically reduce class sizes in specific communities. And while they said that they were going to put hard caps, what we're finding on the ground is that they're not actually hard caps. So they said there's going to be no more than 15, for instance, in a class, or there's not going to be any more than 27 in other classes. And what we're hearing now is that actually some of those classes are going above their caps. And why I bring that up is because, you know, Toronto Public Health keeps saying, okay, this is the way to protect ourselves, is to wear masks, is to make sure we're washing our hands, make sure we're socially distanced. But what we know is that unless you have those hard caps, it is not possible for us to make sure that children are properly socially distanced. And again, then going back to the data, then that's why it gets even more amplified in the Black communities, because we already know that many of there's a large majority of our children that are coming from apartment buildings that are already in very small living spaces that make it difficult even at home. And that and then heaven forbid, if someone is exposed or does contract COVID, they have to isolate in a multi-generational home without sick days. And I guess that kind of just then brings me to the next thing I just wanted to touch on, which, we had a throne speech today that had it mentioned the words anti-Black racism, but failed to address the systemic issues that we are talking about, right? That we know our community need. Sure, it's great that they're going to do more disaggregated data. It's late, but welcome to the party. But it's wonderful that they want to give more money to Black entrepreneurs. I'm not going to say no, as long as they make sure they hire Black children and Black community. But we didn't the announcement didn't address the disproportionate deaths and violence that are perpetrated by the police against our community, right? So we didn't have any announcements that's going to significantly make sure that tomorrow that we don't have any more of those deaths that are happening. How? Black Lives Matter has already laid it out what we needed, a 50% reduction in the police budget, and invest that money into our community by having appropriate mental health resources, by making sure that we address the housing shortage that we have in our community, by making sure that we address the predatory landlords that are pushing our families out into the streets, by making sure that even the small businesses have a more stable income stream to make sure that they can survive. So yeah, the throne speech again represented today another missed opportunity that, I'm sorry, I just feel it's just more performative art by the government and using our community as their shield, trying to avoid a possible election. So what can we do? Like, what are the things that we could be doing, moving forward? And I think that that's where Anna Kay's comments are so instructive, right? So when you have parents who understand the system or have taught themselves the system through their own advocacy for their own child and get the systemic issues, i.e., our schools have been defunded for decades. For every year in the Toronto District School Board, we have been taking money out of the system. We used to have a really large, robust equity department with some very strong equity-minded folks in there. Gone, right? And now it's up to principals to during their monthly staff meetings to do a nice little quick, we're going to do an anti-Black racism module today, right? As if that's going to somehow solve the problem. And so, we have to work together as community with the educators inside the system, with community activists coming together on these issues. We've got to make sure that we properly fund our school systems, and that Doug Ford and Stephen Lecce, even though they say words that they're funding the school properly, we know that they're not. Even the what we're seeing is right now, the cuts are having a profound effect on special education resources. So we have fewer guidance counselors, we have fewer social workers, we have fewer child and youth workers. fewer of the wraparound services that we know that we need in order to help our children be successful. And so I do believe that we've got to continue to fight. We got to continue to be, protest in the streets and making sure that, in 2 years, we're going to have to make sure we appropriately use our vote in a proper way. From a community standpoint, I'm also a chair of an organization called the Urban Alliance on Race Relations. 45 years we've been trying to hold police accountable at the through this police civilian oversight. The government most recently, when they came in, the Ford government rolled back much of the Yakabuchi report that had originally strengthened that police oversight. And you can see kind of the examples of what's happened, like how long it took for us to get just Regis, which we still haven't gotten justice for Regis or any of the other deaths that we've seen. That so police civilian oversight remains an important piece for us. But more specifically, one of the projects that we're working on is called the Black Youth Fellowship. And so what we're doing is we're bringing in a cohort of Black youth. We are going to be going through a training to help them develop the knowledge and skills that they'll need to work in the counselor's office, and not just like work, as the go get me some coffee, but like actually leading projects, so they can develop the knowledge, the skills, and most importantly, the networks, right? The Rolodex that they'll need in order to be a major player in the at City Hall. Also, another one of our projects that we're associated with, I've been associated with, is called the Community Benefits Network. And the Community Benefits Network, we've been fighting to say that, hey, look, if we're going to be building transit in the city, right? So we're spending billions of dollars to build transit. We're going to be hiring all of these contractors. Why don't we hold the contractors accountable to hire people from our community, especially if they're going to be working in our community? And so we've been having some success, not the kind of level of success we want, but it's another project that the kinds of project that I think that we should be able to use, that if we're using public funds to build public projects, we should be making sure that there's an equitable approach to the jobs that come from there. And so I'm gonna kind of pause there, but I really hope that, we've got the academic piece, we've got the activist piece, we've got the parent piece, we've got all the tools that we need to really, create the kind of future to make sure our children are successful too. And I believe that this is kind of the spaces that we have to keep creating. And I'm looking forward to continued conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Nigel, for your reflections. I think it's a great way to segue into our Q&A as we begin to think about how schools and educators accommodate Black students as they face racial injustices, but as well as dealing with COVID-19. And also speaking about your initiatives with Urban Alliance and how to get Black youth not only through the door, but supporting them as well. So I would like to now turn it over to our Q&A. And as we have mentioned before, we have vetted questions from registration for those who would like to appear on screen to ask questions directly to our panelists. And if time allows it, we will also take questions from the Q&A box on Zoom and social media. We just want to preface that with saying to the audience to make sure that you're asking actual questions, not to ramble too much, but we will begin with the first question by a student named Noreen. So we invite her to come on screen and ask the question. Thank you.
Hello. My question is, how can we, as pre-service educators, actively confront anti-Black racism in our profession?
Thank you so much, Noreen. So we'll turn to Fiona to start us off with that question.
I started by saying I didn't have many answers, but I'll try anyway. I think it's important to start with ourselves. I think it's important for us to understand the ways in which we internalize white supremacy. I think it's important for us to question how we benefit from it, how we're complicit in it. But it's also important to move beyond individualizing something that's systemic and to look at the ways in which the system operates, to make sure that we're not adopting colorblind policies. And when I say that, I mean, I don't in any way mean the facile type, addressing comments of I don't see color, which frankly is not just lying, it's stupid. So there's that. But to look at and call out when you have a curriculum that seeks to mute, then you have to start looking at broader things. When you speak about going to school and getting knowledge, what does that mean? Whose knowledge, and knowledge about what? What does it mean to know? Who decides what's worthy to know? So start questioning those things, and then find spaces of your own to challenge and to move through those. Just this past summer, and I don't mean to call out people who probably just wanted to do their own little quiet work, but for example, I have a friend and colleague in Peel, Samantha Stephen, who with a group of dope educators did a number of things. They had book talks, they had sessions where they came together and thought about new ways of doing things, because community is good with this type of work. So form communities, do your individual work, do your collective work, find the spaces that you can do the work, and then challenge systems of oppression every day, all day. It's a thankless job, but it can be personally rewarding.
Thank you so much for that, Fiona. And thank you, Noreen, for joining us for today's discussion. Next, we have a question from Jenna from BIPOC Collective, local QP 905. And Jenna asks, what unions do to help support these efforts? How can we demonstrate our support in tangible ways? So that question is for Nigel.
Look, thank you very much for the question, and because it's important. The labor, labor has had a history of fighting for women's rights. It was part of the civil rights movement, and now it does need to be part of this racial reckoning. I shared with you about the Community Benefits Network. It is a project of the Toronto York Labor Council, and which is a very large collection of unions across Toronto and York region, and so those are important spaces. I mean, all unions, now are starting to have either an equity committee, or they will have an anti-Black racism committee. And it's important for trade unionists in this call to go and to your associations, right? Even to your academic associations, to make sure that the annual budget carves out money to be able to specifically address these issues. And we should be doing it, at our annual meetings unapologetically. It's an important part of the fight back, because I think, just like what Fiona says, it does start, with us, with each individual, dealing with their own anti-racism and anti-Black racism within themselves, and then, what we model for our children and what we model for the community. But for labor, there are labor or unions that are doing this work, that are making it explicit, but it requires we, as rank and file members, or as the membership, the ones that pay for the union or pay for the association to happen, we have to demand to make sure it's part of the action plan each year.
Thank you, Nigel. We would like to go on to the next question. So I'm going to give this to Anna Kay. M from the Ministry of Education asked, what structures and conditions need to be developed by district school boards in order to best respond to Black community voices? And we would like to invite her to come on camera. Oh, I asked the question, but yes, you can answer. Sorry about that.
Hi, good evening.
Okay.
My question is, what structures and conditions need to be developed by district school boards in order to best respond to Black community voices?
I have a few ideas on that. You know, for us, my community, we've always just talking about the intentional hiring of diverse teachers. And that just doesn't include just teachers. It also includes people in decision-making position, because it's one thing to hire a few diverse teachers, but if they have no power in changing anything systematic, then they're just there as a token. And next thing is the school board has to look at things through not necessarily an equal lens, but an equity lens of how you're dealing with communities or racialized communities, that oftentimes these are working poor communities, and their needs will differ from a middle class and an upper class community. And also what these resources providing some of these resources through an anti-Black lens, and as I said, especially an equity lens, and it has to be, when you're coming into the community, it has to be coming in to address and bring an action plan to address many of the issues. And many times parents are able to very much articulate and can problem solve what are some of the issues their children are facing, and how we can make the education system better to address their needs. So I hope that answers your question.
I want to put my hand up a little bit. You know, we don't want to be disingenuous, because for decades, the Black community has been saying, I don't know which God they think is going to come down from the sky and give any sort of new sort of messages. We've been saying it for decades. We've been saying it for over and over and over again. And if they ask, we'll tell them again. You have a curriculum that erases us. So that needs to be rewritten, right? We need to have Black people represented in your curriculum. So when Black children go to school, instead of feeling shame, they can feel pride, right? We want to have you not have police in our schools arresting Black children for things that other people do and get away with. We don't want you channeling our children into different programs so you could herd them over into places like little animals and leave them alone. Education is a social right. It's the same things that parents have been saying, but the same place of know your place aggression, that is the same types of know your place aggression that is wielded onto Black children is wielded onto Black parents. So when you see Black parents, turn up in any number of ways, if they can't freeze you out and totally isolate you, if they can't ask you to repeat yourself as if what you're saying they're not hearing, and so they do their little things, the racial violence, you see it over and over again when Black parents and Black community members and Black children turn up to say, this is the experience that our children are having, and we're not having it anymore, right? But we can also not pretend as if the system does not benefit some people over others. So when we're turning up and we're asking for things, right? They may pretend they don't know that what this means is that a more equitable distribution of what we have in our system, right? So that it can better serve everybody. What we are asking people to do is unseat themselves from seats of power, right? And they like the power that they have. So they're not about to give that up. And so when we say, what can they do to listen? They need to want to hear. They need to commit to hearing. They need to think about what does it mean for people when you unfairly and unjustly treat people in this particular way? What does it mean for your own humanity when you fail to see that other people are human beings too? They need to start thinking about those issues. Well, just a few words.
No, thank you for that, Fiona. I see waves and snaps and it all from Nigel and everyone. So thank you for that. I do know also from working with the Black mothers in my research project is that, they say parents should be involved, parents should be engaged. But, when parents do show up, there's a policing of Black parents, particularly Black women, and they're not welcome in the school space. So it's like, who is this school space for, right? So yeah, no, thank you for that. And thank you, Anna Kay, for speaking to the importance of representation. I do have a friend who's in early years and had a student run up to her because she works in a neighborhood that's predominantly white. And this Black young student ran up to her and said, "Oh, your skin is like mine." And the student was so happy and hugged her. This was pre-COVID last year, but hugged her for that. So that's actually nice, but it's heartbreaking, right? So anyway, I don't want to interject too much. We do have another question here. And this question is from Amina from York Region District School Board. So this question is, what are some effective strategies for approaching resistance and gaslighting from white educators? So this is from Amina, and the question is for Fiona. So we'll invite you again, Fiona. And again, this is a conversation, so folks can definitely jump in. Our panelists, we're all eager to hear from all of you. So definitely jump in, but we'll start off with Fiona for this one. Do you want me to reread it?
Yes, please.
Okay.
From Sears.
Pardon?
I was retweeting Sears, so.
Okay. All right. So Amina from York Region District School Board has a question. What are some effective strategies for approaching resistance and gaslighting by white educators?
Don't let people off the hook when they're going to pretend like that's what they're doing. Then you need to uncover it. Call it what it is. And it could be that this is where I am today in my head. Today I am not having it. We know that this is what this is, and call it for what it is, because you know that it's going to happen. You know that they're going to preface it, their behavior, that they're going to ask little things or they're going to act in little ways. But it doesn't hurt to be known for who you are. That limits some of it. And then when you hear it, call it out, or you could do something like asking, what do you mean? Or would you like to explain? Could you say a little bit more? Adopt little white sounding things if you think it's sorry, if you think it's going to be too harmful to call it for what it is. Those are some of the ways we do it. And sometimes taking a proactive approach to doing anti-racist work.
Fiona's just killing it right now for me. I could listen to her for all night, and I totally agree. That, the only part I just want to also acknowledge that we know that this is this emotional trauma, that this generational trauma that our parents and our grandparents and our ancestors have been going through. So I mean, I think doing it, do what Fiona says, but at the same time we want to be self-caring at our own time. When we want to, if you're gonna put somebody. Yeah, I think we have to do it, but I think also we want to be taking care of ourselves too. It's so, heavy. I think that's the point I just want to make. But I totally agree with what Fiona said about how to holding folks accountable when they make those kinds of gaslighting comments. We have to.
Thank you, Fiona and Nigel. Our next question is for Nigel, and it's from Kaylee from the Peel District School Board. So we invite them to come on screen and ask their question.
Hi.
Hey, Kaylee.
So my question is, how can we explicitly teach our students how to be anti-racist advocates? And then when we do that, how do we set up safe ways for those students to report racist incidents?
Hey, are you a school teacher in the system, Peel? At Peel? Hey, listen, you guys have just gone through a lot. You took one of our top educators, by the way. I just want to tell you, who's now running Peel, your new district school board director of education at Peel, who used to.
She's amazing. I like her a lot.
Oh yeah. Oh, trust me. Yeah, and quite knowledgeable, especially around what you're talking about. And I mean, you know, as fellow educators, we don't all have all of the answers. You know, you're going to talk to some of your colleagues. This is a good place to start. I think Fiona pointed out around, and Annika, it's about creating safe spaces. It is about starting with ourselves. We do as educators. How to be an anti-racist, right? Anti-racist. It's not just enough to say, I'm not racist. It's about learning how to be an anti-racist. And I think we're starting by modeling for our students, as you and I, we do all the time, for, you know, about how we treat each other, the kinds of expectations that we expect of each other. And I think it's looking for those teachable moments, you know, where we can bring folks into our community circles and talk about, you know, what was said and how it hurt, you know, how and why it hurts, and how different ways that folks can approach those things. You know, for me, and I don't know what my fellow panelists will say, so I'm not speaking on their behalf, but when children make comments, they heard it somewhere, right? Yeah. Like, you know, they heard it from home, and or they might have heard it on the street, and they might have heard, like, they heard it from somewhere. And so how do we help children to understand, you know, this is not, you know, how to be an anti-racist is, I think, our goals as educators. And so I definitely, you know, you start by modeling for them. I think you start by creating the safe space in the classroom, the high expectations of how we love and treat each other. I think you definitely talk with your director, but it's great that you're even on here to again, doing on your own time during a pandemic. Like, these are you're setting the examples even for your own colleagues, right? So this is, I appreciate you asking the question and being here. And I'm not sure if my other fellow panelists might want to build on those comments.
I'm just gonna piggyback after just what you said, Nigel. You know, for me, I strongly believe it starts with yourself, of just understanding the subject matter, and also checking our own biases, because we all have those biases. And with young children, for them to be able to ask those questions, no matter how how sensitive they are, that there's a safe space. And if you're not able to provide those answers, maybe figuring out networks to be able to provide that information. You know, I think about my own community in a sense of where, you know, we had a lot of things going on and we wanted to include teachers in it. And a lot of them did not want to participate in it because they had an outlook on the community as being violent, and they felt like if they step outside of the school building that they would be shot or harassed, right? So they went to even like their unions to make sure that they didn't have to participate in, you know, I'm going to use an example of the walk of excellence in their community, of the showcasing what the community is about, right? So at the same time, you have to have a connection to where you're teaching, who you're teaching, and understanding where each student's lives or that lives are diverse in the sense of their home life, their families, even their education, the way they learn, and just their nature and nurture and everything. So I think those are all things that we just have to be mindful of.
Thank you so much for that, Annika. We do have some wonderful questions from the chat box and the Q&A box. We'll ask that you use the Q&A box instead of chat. It's easier to get the questions through there. So we'll switch over to some of those questions and from social media and frame it as a question. Less commentary, the better. I'm sorry, but the better in terms of getting through the questions. Okay, so we have a question from Melanie. And this question is going to be for Anna Kay. How can new non-BIPOC teachers establish lines of trust with Black families and community members and include them in classroom learning and decision-making? So new teachers who are non-Black, Indigenous, racialized, I guess this is white teachers, right? That's from Melanie for Anna Kay.
All right. First, you have to be sincere. You also have to be open to have those conversations with parents in terms of if it's about their student or even around their family life, whatever it is. Just also make sure you create a space where that student and their family can trust you in terms of having conversation about their children, how to better excel their children within the school system. Also, make sure you have done some work on how to have these very sensitive subject matter with families, just to make sure that your question is, or your questions is coming from a place of genuineness instead of assumption. So we deal with a lot of, sometimes I know a lot of teachers, they jump to an assumption of what that family is about or who those children are. And I just think that you have to make sure you do your work in terms of learning about other cultures and the diverse background. You have to do that self-work first, and then see what those parents are open, what type of conversation they're open to having. And Nigel, you can definitely jump in, or Fiona, but I just, for my approach, I'm working from an approach where I can't always interject anger in dealing with the school board, else I'm gonna have an aneurysm and die soon. Like, honestly, it's I have to. It's not that you're not angry and you're not passionate about sometimes what's happening in the schools. It's just that mental health and anxiety and depression, something will kill me, and I want to have at least another 70 years on this earth, you know, to see my children and my great grandchildren. So that's just the lens I come from.
It's funny you mention anger. I called Janelle today and I said, I'm not usually myself. I'm not feeling myself much these days. So believe it or not, Anna Kay, every now and again, whiteness operates on you in a way that
Yeah.
you hear. But believe it or not, I'm usually full of joy and pleasantness.
No, it's not to you, Fiona. I'm just saying overall, you know, don't worry. I understand passion. I get it all.
Okay.
But I'm just saying, for me, don't mind if you know, I think that I'm dealing with a lot as a parent, and you know, have 2 children in the school system, to, you know, and you're working with the community and you see community needs and you see parents are truly struggling to navigate the school systems and even just their personal lives. A lot of parents are not working, or, you know, have lost their employment and they're working precarious jobs, and they're wondering, you know, if they send their children to school and they get COVID, you know, it's just.
But all of these are results,
yeah,
of a system that's racist. So for example, we do know that particularly for new Black immigrants, many of us come and have a higher level of education than the average white person who was born and raised in Canada. And in spite of any education that we come with, Black and other people of color, we are hardly afforded the quote unquote opportunity to work within our fields. Many of what we have, many of what we acquire from an education or in terms of capital does not pass down to our children. The Black families who are having trouble, you know, your social class any education or income that you have will not protect your children. One of the ways that our school system further marginalizes our kids is that they simultaneously lump all Black people into one and treat you, as one, but at the same time individualizes you when it's time to look at Black people as a group. So it has its different ways of making sure that at the end of the day, the result is the same. And the result ends up with Black people overrepresented as quote unquote essential workers. You don't even know you're bloody essential on it until it's time to put you in harm's way. So you're essential. So now you have to be out there. You're on public transit. You're in low paying jobs. It's not just one job, it's 10,000. You're stressed, you're immunocompromised, any number of things. And so, it's exacerbated and everything's exacerbated. And then your children at once are losing out from some aspects of schooling. But in many ways, we're thanking God that we're not hearing the daily calls about, your kid shifted in their seat. Right? And so you're caught between a rock and a hard place. And so this is not to say that there's not a single Black kid who's had positive experiences. My own children have had fair experiences in school. Now, if they were white boys, I don't know what it could have been. Might have been a lot better, even though they were fairly good. So yes, there are some positives. Yes, there are some positives. And yes, there are things we could do. One teacher, I think, asked a question about how do you have these sort of race-conscious conversations with children. There's a really good book written by Matthew Kay called, Not Light But Fire. Sorry for the angry title sounding that I'm now going to suggest. But it's a really good book that highlights how teachers could hold conversations about race in their classroom. It has all sorts of nice frameworks and whatnot that you could use. And children, I find, in my experience as an educator, children are a lot more open to critical conversations. If you want to go to class and have a good day, have it be the day when you're engaging in a critical conversation. Everybody lights up, right? Especially when they can have an opportunity to speak their minds. They really like it.
Thank you, Anna Kay and Fiona. We have a question from the chat by Kirk, and they asked, what do Black communities need to do now to address systemic anti-Black racism in school boards, starting with trustees and directors of education? I'll give this question to Nigel. Thank you.
Kirk, thank you very, very much for the question, because it is key, because we're doing all this battling, right? So we're battling to make sure that our children are cared and for and loved. We're battling to make sure that we're paying our rent, our mortgage. We're battling just to deal with the gaslighting that we're dealing every day. And then there's that whole political piece that many within our community, we're characterized within our community as just saying that we don't get politically involved, or that because we're not considered a voting force, that our issues aren't taken as seriously as other communities. And the reason why I'm jumping off there with your question, Kirk, is that we know that, for instance, the MPP that's voted in has a direct effect on and whoever's in power determines what the education budget is. So making sure that we have a member of provincial parliament that understands and is running on an anti-Black racism policies and platform has to be a part of this of our next steps in transforming public education. The trustees, and now while trustees' power was significantly reduced by Mike Harris, trustees still are the ones that have to give the final approval on who the director is, who gets to be a superintendent, who gets to be the principals within a system. So as much as your trustee might say, oh, I don't have the power to do that, They actually have the power to make systemic change. So we have to make sure that we're voting in a trustee, that the next time they knock on your door or they're sending you a flyer saying, please vote for me, we ask, what is your anti-Black racism platform, right? And because we have grown so used to the decades of defunding of our system that we're not like, while I agree we have to demand that the curriculum change, if we don't deal with, for instance, the large class sizes that we see in grades 4 to 8, that that sometimes we see up in the high school areas, if we don't deal with making sure that we have enough guidance counselors that understand our community and our children and aren't just streaming us into the into the lower streams when they get into high school, if we don't have the social workers that are going to be able to help give, connect the parents into the community to whatever health supports that they need, those are kinds of supports that are also necessary to build the kinds of schools that our children deserve. So this is political, right? And people might want to say, no, it's not, Nigel, please, it's political. And if we don't, make sure that we have political representation that has an anti-Black racism lens at all of those different levels that I just shared with you, then we're not going to deal with the systemic issues that we're referring to.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Nigel, for that and making the connection.
Fiona looked like she's about to jump in. I think she was.
Oh, okay.
I like the part about representation, particularly make sure you go out and instead of voting for a trustee, run it to be a trustee. So make sure you're there when it's time for you to make the decisions about what happens for your children, because they absolutely have a lot of power over what happens in our schools. Make sure you're running. Last time I was sitting in our boardroom, and you could ask Peel parents what are some of the things they do. We have a playbook. Well, Peel parents do anyway.
But I also want to say that it's also making sure that this information is also available to parents. Not many parents know that your school trustee is the one that's making some of these crucial decision making, right? So it's also about the information, how information is being passed through some of these community. And oftentimes when a lot of these conversations are happening, it's or they already happened is when the community are hearing about it. So they're not necessarily being able to put their 2 cents in, right? So it's, we also have to be mindful of that. Is also how information is passed into the community.
And for those of us who are Black parents who live in our communities, engage with other families. One of the ways in which white supremacy is allowed to operate is when they teach our children, and when we buy into it too, that some Black people are different from other Black people. It's like those Black people. You see it in schools. I remember when my little girl, my younger daughter, started school, and I asked about, other Black friends that she may have in her class, and she commented that the other Black girl in her class was, she was different because she was always in the office and always. So I had to be like, nope, you're not different. You're still Black. So we're not going to buy into that. We have to start seeing ourselves, or continue to see ourselves, or more openly see ourselves as part of a Black community, as a part of a community that has worked together, that has advocated together, that has lived and fought and loved together, and that we love openly each other and each other's children, so that we're taking care of each other. And when somebody else cannot advocate in a way that you can, that you step up, and that when you go in to address issues for your child, you do not only address the issue for your child, but you address issues that are institutional and that operate on all children, right? And so that you're covering with as much love and justice those who are around.
Thank you so much for that, Fiona. That approach of collectivity and moving beyond just the individual, and the respectability politics, which are real too, right, in our community. So next we have a question. I'd like to invite Maria from the Peel District School Board. It kind of relates to this last point, but if Maria can come on camera and introduce the question that they have, that would be great. Welcome.
Hi, my question is, how do we use an anti-oppression lens to dismantle anti-Black racism or any other forms of oppression in education research? Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. And we were thinking to go with Fiona with this question to start us off.
We could think about what are the questions that we're asking? How can we, when we think about educational research, what questions are we asking? How are we developing those questions? Whose ideas are we taking or leaning into or reflecting on even before we start asking which questions, right? For a really long time, for example, we talked about the achievement gap. And we did so, and there's so much literature on this achievement gap without any real focus on, you know, on the opportunity gap, for example, or the gaps in access, or we weren't asking questions about systemic racism in clear ways, or we were not thinking about, for example, or making clear or uncovering ideas of racial capitalism, for example, and how that operates in schools. You know, who benefits when we have these pull-out programs, these school success programs, these spec ed programs, these 100,000,000 programs to fix kids, but are really spaces where we extract, hold and secure Black children, almost like little prisons, where they're off on their own, right? In dead end programs. So how are we asking those questions? Who designs these? Who benefits from these? Whose imaginations do these things come from? And how do we upset these? How do we move towards a more transformative space where we're upending these injustices? So we have to, I think, start afresh, and we really have to reimagine what's possible, and then start leaning into, you know, what might that be, and how could we learn, for example, from other people who are doing really transformative work? What's that, and what does it look like, and how do we bring it into our systems?
Thank you, Fiona. We have only a few more minutes until our end, so we'll try to get in as many questions as possible. The next question is from Temi Tope to Anna K, and she asks, thank you for those great insights. How can Black newcomer parents support their kids' education when they know little about the Canadian education system?
Yes, so the first thing I always say is find out what community organizations are within your community. Oftentimes, those community organizations will always have information to be able to help you to access either an education group, or they have someone that's working on education and can help or assist parents in navigating the school system. And I always say never be afraid, even as a newcomer, to ask questions. I mean, when I migrated here 22 years ago, and my father would go into the school as a man who was working 3 jobs, you know, and we were still working poor, even though he was working 3 jobs. It was very difficult for him. He didn't feel comfortable as a man, as a single father, going into a system and as a newcomer, to ask crucial questions of how we're doing, what can he do to help us to be able to be a little bit more successful academically wise, or even to address some of the issues we were facing around bullying. So never be apologetic in asking questions. And if you don't know, there's always somebody that knows. And also, but maybe connecting with other parents and to see what information they have, or even in ways that they've been navigating the system. And it's, as I said, it's an ongoing learning process. So this is where, if you have access to the internet, you're Googling, you're finding out information, and it's a teaching process. But one thing I must say is, if you have a community of other parents, even as a newcomer, that you can tap into, do it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry.
No, thank you for that, Annika. I do want to go to one question, which I think might be helpful for parents as well as we are entering this online, or we're in this online world. It's from Sandrine Porter. And Sandrine asked, what are some effective tools and strategies that can be implemented for the success of racialized kids, especially now that we're transitioning into the virtual world of learning? The question stems from the fact that there are racialized students that were marginalized within the classrooms and not having equitable resources to succeed as their non-racialized counterparts. So what does that look like now in this unprecedented time? I was thinking perhaps Annika can start us off, but all panelists can speak to this, really the inequities of what existed before and how racialized parents are shifting to this online world and what that might look like and what resources can they tap into, if any.
So as parents are tapping into the online or the virtual learning, I mean, majority of them are probably doing it fair with the COVID, especially if you live in community that's disproportionately affected by COVID. Another thing is even just around let's even just jump back a little bit to April when they were going to start remote learning. We have to think about communities who were affected in terms of access to even internet and devices to be able to even tap into remote learning. And now we're talking about parents who can afford these things called learning pods. And you know, and if your child who didn't benefit from remote learning because it was hard to get in touch with the teacher, it was hard to use the technology, or you had to wait on the schools to send you some form of technology. If you had 3 kids and you only had 1 computer and you need the school to send you 2 more so each kid can have a device. It's those type of equity about creating a space where parents are able to, even if it's virtual learning, how can you make sure that your child is not falling behind, or even just the learning gaps that we know have happened within that 6 months or even existed before. So one other thing is I'm thinking in terms of who are those online teachers. Also, I know that it's a little bit different this time, where there's an online teacher, there's an online principal, there's supposed to be some online support, making sure that you have information to tap into those things. Because I know a majority of parents can't afford, especially during this time now, for those private tutoring programs or learning pods or those other things. So I hope that answers your question, because I forgot part of your question. I'm sorry, Janelle.
That's okay. I think that really covers it, right?
Okay.
So thank you so much for that. I'm going to switch over. We are close to the end, and my goodness, I've never seen a panel with so many questions and so many brilliant questions as well. So there is definitely the energy to be engaged out there and to move it towards action. We want to thank everyone for their questions, but also with that, let you know that it wouldn't be possible for us to get through all of these questions. It probably would take a 4-hour day, I think. So we do thank you, and we will come together. It's not the end. We're going to take a couple more questions before we wrap up. We're going to go 10 minutes over, if that's okay for folks, just so that we can get these final questions in. I'm publicly asking the panelists, but if that's okay, yeah, Annika already said yeah.
Yes,
Fiona, okay, you're with us. No one has any plans to go anywhere. Okay, thank you. Thank you. So we'll be able to manage to get a few more questions in. So I'll pass it on to Julie now. Thank you for that.
Yes, thank you. So our next question is from Barbara. And they asked, what is the role, if there is one, of white allies in this movement? They consented to be on screen, so we'll ask them to come on camera. I asked the question again.
That's okay, Julie.
You asked it beautifully. That's it. Yeah. And also, I feel like the panelists have addressed it in many ways, but if there are ways that haven't been addressed, I'd love to hear them.
You know, and I'd like Barbara to stay on camera and tell us what does she see as her role in this as an ally.
That's a very fair question. I think all the panelists have said do your own work first, and I see that as my first and most important thing. And then the second is, once I feel like I've done enough work that I can meaningfully engage and respectfully engage, then join in whatever way is appropriate.
I would also suggest, Barbara, that we don't wait until we're perfect.
Oh, I always wait until I'm perfect and it never works. So you're right.
Learning about anti-racism and not doing anti-racism work. So, I want to invite you to go ahead. You know, when I think about some early folks and some folks who've been doing anti-racist work for a long time, many of them are people who are white. Who've been calling out racism for decades, right? And so we have to see this. Critical race theorists, you know, talk often about interest convergence. What is your interest in this as a human being? And I'm not even particularly religious, but whenever I think about being a human being, I think about, you know, my soul. What does it mean to not honor the humanity of others? What does it mean for you to be fully human and to engage in human work, right? The work of humanizing others and making it so that we can all live, right? What does that mean for you? And how do you do it every day?
And just to piggyback off what Fiona said, you know, I've been saying this for the last year or two, you know, around that the onus is not just only on the Black community or racialized group in this, because at the end of the day, things that we think don't affect us today eventually will come knocking on our door at some point in the future. So it's best for us to now, maybe this is the time with everything happening in the world, to really think about how we put ourselves in other people's shoes. Even we know many of us will never experience this, but it's about just taking a moment and just imagine if you were in someone else's shoes, and what's the support you would need, and how you'd want collectively to know that your lives matter in every capacity. So I think that's the best frame to just look at it from, is that the onus is not just on racialized people to fix this problem.
Thank you, Fiona and Anna Kay. The next question we have is also from the chat. It's from Sandrine, and she asks, what are some effective tools and strategies that can be implemented for the success of racialized kids, especially now that they are transitioned into the virtual world of learning? This question is stemming from the fact that there are racialized students that were marginalized within classrooms and not having equitable resources to succeed as their non-racialized counterparts. So I'll give this question to Nigel. Thank you.
Sure. No, thanks for the question. I mean, I am really concerned about how remote learning is affecting our children. Like there is obviously what seems to be like the kinds of resources that are available to many of our parents are different from other communities. But concretely, like, look, if you can find a space in your home where you can like make it your child's space, you know, where they can do their work, you know, quietly and no one's going to disturb them. I know that probably you might be saying, please, Nigel, this is not but if you can do that, that would be the best, start. Having the access to a device that works in internet. And if you don't have that, call your child's parent and say, hey, I need a device. Hey, I need access to internet. The school board and the Minister of Education is committed to making sure that everybody has a device and everybody has access to the internet. And obviously, just like what we always do in community, like we have the older siblings working with our younger siblings, if that's your situation. But we are going to be, we're rethinking. We are having to rethink, what does school look like now for my child if it's not safe enough for them to actually go into the building, and that's a brand new curriculum, a brand new pedagogical approach for some. Right, there are educators that are quite used to doing what they call outdoor schooling, and schooling outside of it, but devices, talk to your school if you don't have it, and if you can find a good study space for your child, make sure that they stay on a schedule. A schedule is very important for the children in this process, that they're not sleeping in, they're getting up, having their breakfast, they start their work, then they have their lunch, they might go outside for a walk, come back, so making sure that we continue those routines.
I don't know. I think I like a lot of this, but I also think that this is the opportunity for us as parents to reimagine. Here we are talking about the curriculum that erases us. What are we doing to tell our own stories to our children? What are we doing to show our children how we problem solve? What are we doing when we show our children how we make decisions, how we prioritize, or taking care of each other? How are we doing things in our own homes that, instead of reproducing oppression, how are we finding time to connect with our children, like in real and meaningful ways? Teaching each other recipes from our own homes. Like, this is our space too, and if you have the power within your own space to start thinking about what are the things that are meaningful to you, this is, I think, a perfect opportunity to start centering some of those things, and I'll say this little last piece, and then I know I talk too much. I remember my daughter asking one day, she woke up first thing in the morning, and she came into my room, and I was reading, and she asked, what was I reading? And Mom, you're always reading something, or you're always studying. You don't know everything yet? Every day? And I said, for those of us who can, we have a responsibility to do it. And I said, for your own sake, you have a responsibility as well. And you're a really bright girl. And so a lot is going to be required of you to help to solve some of these really huge human problems that we have. And so you have to lean into learning so that you could do that. And I that morning I was reflecting on my own schooling and on all the time I've spent on the semicolon I'll never get back. I wish we started, you know what I mean? Like, who cares? I could have spent all that time, right, with the real work of learning how you could be a freedom fighter. That would have been better time better served. So how do we do that with our children in the time we have available?
Totally agree. And I think, when the question was asked, for me, it was concretely about the current system, the way it is. Mm-hmm. We are at that moment of reckoning, of rethinking education. Yeah. But these are, you're asking important questions. So does this mean that we're going to go away from the public education system as it stands right now? Because we do pay taxes into supporting this public education system. If we're going to do homeschooling, how are we going to support it?
Nigel, no taxation without representation. That sounds familiar.
If I want, my parents were my first teachers. I agree with you.
I can't publicly say, so I won't say that I'm saying take your kids out of it. I don't think I can. So I won't say that.
Well, this is why we're having this conversation, because we need to have these important discussions. And there was, there were quite a few parents who said they're so happy that their kids are home with them right now because they don't have to deal with the anti-Black racism. Yep. But there's another conversation we need to have too later on in terms of the function and the importance of the public education and a fully funded and accessible public education system with services, because rethinking education is key, right? But we don't want a private system. At least I speak for myself there. Okay, so thank you, everyone. You know, we had so many questions. I've never seen this. It's amazing. Just the energy and the heart that everyone has. Thank you to the panelists. And, you know, the conversations were just mind-blowing, and I'm so happy. I'm so grateful. There's so many notes in terms of leading into learning that Fiona said, rethinking education, and Annika's just beautiful and brilliant insight in terms of what parents can actually do. And as a community leader, just to have Annika's voice on this panel is absolutely incredible. So thanks, everyone. I hope we can compile the questions. We'll save the chat and the Q&A. And I think it would be a big task for the center, but I think it would be a very interesting one to compile them and kind of loop back to everyone somehow, and just see, you know, how we can continue this conversation and move it into action. So I'll turn it over to my esteemed and good friend and colleague, Julie.
Yes, just to echo Janelle's sentiments, we are so grateful to have learned from you, and we hope to continue this conversation long after this webinar. Before we close out, I just wanted to make a few announcements. First, our next webinar, which will be on anti-Muslim racism and anti-Blackness, will take place in October, so please stay tuned for that. And we also publish newsletters during the first week of every month, which you can find on our website. And all information will be in the chat box, or you could just visit our Twitter at Oisy Sears. And we currently have 5,000 newsletter readers, so we would like to expand our readership. And we publish resource guides that accompany each webinar we host. So if you want to rewatch the webinar, you can access it on YouTube or in a podcast format that will be released shortly. And Janelle could talk about the event that Professor Nana Day has coming up.
Yes, thank you so much, Julie. So, you know, Professor Nana Day is a mentor to so many of us. He is the director of the Center for Integrative Anti-Racism Studies, and a lot of the theories and the practice around anti-racism education in Canada has come from his scholarship and commitment to these issues. So if you really want to hone in and hear, you know, from this brilliant mind and mentor and caring person, please tune in tomorrow. I don't know if someone can share it on the screen for me right now. Oh, great. Thank you, Sophie. So this is a talk that Nana is having. It's hosted by Boston University. It's a very prestigious talk, and it's on decolonial perspectives in teaching about African history. So to continue this conversation, it's not a one-off. So I invite everyone to attend it, and the link Mary Carmen has shared in the chat, so you can register. The link is in the chat, and we're sharing this on our social media. So please, please, please join. And thank you for sharing that, Sophie. I appreciate it.
And lastly, we would like to thank our incredible team at Sears for organizing this event, along with Professor Nana Day's leadership and with support from Dr. Frempong. We would like to invite our volunteers and coordinators to come on the screen just to quickly say hi.
And Nana Day, Professor Nana Day too.
Dr. Frempong as well. Thank you all for helping us organize. A lot of work was
really good.
Yeah, excellent work.
Yes, it's just great.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Wow.
Yeah, Anna back on camera.
That's great.
For all joining us, and we will see you again next month. Have a good night. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
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 Bye.